The story of the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988 stands apart from other Middle Eastern conflicts of the 20th century. The Six-Day War lasted less than a week. The Yom Kippur War ended within 3 weeks, and the Gulf War would be over in 6 weeks. Yet the Iran-Iraq War dragged on for 8 years, producing scenes that shocked the world as teenage boys advanced in waves toward machine gun positions. Chemical weapons turned battlefields into killing zones. Cities endured bombardment with missiles for months, and oil tankers burned in the Persian Gulf. When it finally ended in August 1988, the borders remained exactly where they had been when it started, and perhaps 1 million people were dead for nothing. September 22nd, 1980, at dawn, Iraqi fighter jets screamed across the border, striking Iranian airfields as explosions tore through runways and destroyed aircraft on the ground. Within hours, Iraqi armored columns rolled into Iran's Khuzestan province across a 300-mile front, tanks rumbling through border towns while infantry followed behind armored vehicles. Saddam Hussein appeared on Iraqi television in military uniform, announcing that Iraq was liberating Arab lands from Persian occupation, expecting Iranian resistance to collapse within weeks, perhaps days. The war would last 8 years. Saddam Hussein had spent months calculating the odds before ordering the invasion, and Iran appeared vulnerable beyond anything Iraq had faced before. The Islamic Revolution in 1979 had overthrown the Shah and brought Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini to power, installing a revolutionary government that purged the military's officer corps by executing or imprisoning thousands suspected of loyalty to the old regime, dissolving units as conscripts deserted, and allowing American-made equipment to fall into disrepair without spare parts or technicians to maintain it. Iran's conventional military capability had collapsed just as internal power struggles consumed the government's attention, creating what Saddam saw as an opportunity to settle old grievances over disputed territory along the border and establish Iraq as the Persian Gulf's dominant power. Khomeini's revolutionary ideology threatened Iraq directly through calls for Islamic revolution throughout the Muslim world, particularly in nations with Shia populations living under Sunni governments. Iraq's Shia majority, concentrated in the south near the Iranian border and in Baghdad's slums, represented a potential threat if they responded to Iranian appeals, and Saddam, who had consolidated absolute power in Iraq by 1979 through purging rivals and establishing a personality cult backed by secret police, viewed the invasion as necessary to prevent revolutionary contagion while Iran remained weak. The initial invasion achieved success as Iraqi forces pushed into Iranian territory, surrounding the port city of Khorramshahr and advancing toward Abadan, while Iranian defenses, hampered by military purges and equipment shortages, struggled to organize resistance. Iraqi commanders reported capturing territory with minimal casualties, and victory appeared imminent to officers who believed Saddam's promises that the war would end quickly. Khorramshahr became the invasion's first indication that Iraqi expectations were catastrophically wrong, as Iraqi forces surrounded the city in late September, expecting quick surrender, but instead encountered Iranian defenders who fought for every building. What began as conventional assault became urban warfare that resembled Stalingrad more than any Middle Eastern conflict, devolving into house-to-house combat where Iranian defenders, a mix of remaining regular army units, Revolutionary Guards, and armed civilians, barricaded themselves in buildings and fired from windows and rooftops, while Iraqi tanks advancing down streets were ambushed by rocket-propelled grenades fired from upper floors. Snipers turned intersections into kill zones, where entire blocks changed hands multiple times as attackers and defenders fought room by room through shattered buildings. The fighting lasted more than a month, while Iraqi artillery pounded the city into rubble and airstrikes collapsed buildings on defenders and attackers alike, until Iraqi forces finally captured Khorramshahr in late October, with the city destroyed and Iraqi casualties numbering in the thousands. But more significant than the tactical outcome was what the resistance had demonstrated about Iranian determination to fight with desperate commitment, making clear that the quick victory Saddam had envisioned was already impossible. Through 1981, both sides settled into positions resembling the Western Front of World War I, with trenches stretching across hundreds of miles, separated by barbed wire, minefields, and fortifications, while artillery duels produced casualties without changing positions. The war had become a stalemate within a year of starting. But Iran was mobilizing for total war, as Ayatollah Khomeini framed resistance not merely as national defense, but as holy war, defending Islam against Iraqi aggression. Young men volunteered by the hundreds of thousands, motivated by revolutionary fervor and religious conviction, swelling the Basij militia with teenage volunteers who would become the war's most tragic figures. In September 1981, Iran launched its first major counteroffensive, aimed at breaking Iraqi positions and eventually liberating occupied territory, introducing tactics that would characterize much of the war and produce horrific casualties. Rather than relying on armor and artillery in conventional combined arms operations, Iran used mass infantry assaults, where Revolutionary Guards and Basij militia attacked in waves, advancing toward Iraqi positions in successive groups numbering thousands, implementing what became known as human wave attacks that were exactly as the name suggested. Young Iranians, many of them teenage Basij volunteers wearing headbands proclaiming their readiness for martyrdom, advanced across minefields and through barbed wire toward Iraqi trenches as Iraqi defenders opened fire with machine guns, artillery, and rockets. The attackers fell in heaps, but more came behind them, overwhelming defensive positions through sheer numbers and willingness to accept casualties that conventional armies would consider unacceptable. Survivors who participated in these assaults described advancing over the bodies of those who had fallen in previous waves, while the sound of machine gun fire was continuous and artillery shells exploded in the midst of advancing troops, throwing bodies into the air. Some attacks succeeded in reaching Iraqi positions, where hand-to-hand combat erupted in trenches, while others collapsed under fire before reaching enemy lines, leaving battlefields covered with dead and wounded. By March 1982, Iran had broken the siege of Abadan and was pushing Iraqi forces back at staggering cost, with thousands of young Iranians dying in offensives that worked tactically as Iraqi positions, even when killing hundreds of attackers could be overrun when ammunition ran low or when defenders panicked at the relentless advance of men willing to die. In May 1982, Iran recaptured Khorramshahr in a major offensive that killed thousands on both sides, achieving symbolically enormous victory as Iran liberated the first major city Iraq had captured. Television footage showed Iranian soldiers raising the national flag over ruined buildings while bodies littered the streets, and Khomeini appeared before massive crowds in Tehran, celebrating the victory and calling for continuation of the war until Saddam Hussein was overthrown. By June 1982, Iranian forces had driven Iraqi troops back across the international border, forcing Iraq to fight on its own territory as Saddam Hussein, recognizing that his invasion had failed catastrophically, proposed a ceasefire and withdrawal to pre-war borders. He was willing to accept status quo ante bellum, the situation before the war, but Iran refused because Khomeini and Iran's revolutionary leadership saw opportunity to overthrow Saddam's government and spread Islamic Revolution to Iraq, believing momentum was with Iran and that Iraqi forces, defeated and demoralized, appeared vulnerable. On July 13, 1982, Iran launched an invasion into Iraq aimed at capturing Basra, Iraq's second-largest city, but the invasion failed as Iraqi forces, defending their own soil with shorter supply lines and prepared positions, held firm. What followed was years of attritional warfare, where neither side could achieve breakthrough, but neither would accept compromise, grinding on through 1983, 1984, 1985, consuming lives and resources while borders barely moved and the war settled into a stalemate that resembled the Western Front more than any modern conflict. As the war stalemated, Iraq turned to weapons that had been banned by international law for more than half a century, beginning in 1983 to use chemical weapons against Iranian troops. The attacks started with mustard gas, a blistering agent that burned skin and lungs, leaving Iranian soldiers who lacked adequate protective equipment suffering terrible injuries as those exposed developed painful blisters covering their bodies while their lungs filled with fluid, and many died slowly, drowning in their own bodily fluids. Iraq expanded its chemical arsenal to include nerve agents like tabun and sarin, which were even more deadly as soldiers exposed to these weapons convulsed violently while their nervous systems shut down, gasping for air as their muscles paralyzed, with death coming within minutes for those who received significant doses, while survivors often suffered permanent neurological damage. The chemical attacks were militarily effective and morally appalling, deployed when Iranian human wave attacks threatened to overwhelm positions, with Iraqi commanders ordering artillery shells filled with mustard gas or nerve agents that exploded among advancing Iranians, settling over battlefields as invisible killers where soldiers collapsed in agony and those who tried to help them were themselves overcome by chemicals. Iran protested to international bodies about Iraqi use of chemical weapons, and United Nations inspectors confirmed the attacks had occurred, but international response was muted as Western nations, fearing Iranian victory and the spread of Islamic Revolution, continued providing Iraq with chemicals that could be used to manufacture weapons, while intelligence agencies shared satellite imagery showing Iranian troop positions. The message was clear that Iraq's use of illegal weapons would not prevent Western support, demonstrating the cynicism of great power politics where international law meant little when strategic interests were at stake. By 1984, both sides had expanded the war beyond land combat to attack each other's economies, with Iraq beginning to attack oil tankers bound for Iranian ports despite Iraq's limited Gulf access. Iranian oil exports, crucial for financing the war effort, became targets as Iraqi aircraft fired missiles at tankers in the Persian Gulf, damaging or sinking ships and causing insurance rates for vessels calling at Iranian ports to skyrocket. Iran retaliated by attacking tankers serving Iraq's Arab allies, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who were providing Iraq with billions in loans and allowing Iraqi oil to be exported through their territories. Iranian speedboats, small and fast, approached tankers in Gulf waters where Revolutionary Guards fired rockets or attached mines to hulls, causing ships to burn and sailors to die, as the Persian Gulf, through which much of the world's oil passed, became a war zone. The attacks threatened global oil supplies and drew international intervention as the United States, already backing Iraq diplomatically and with intelligence, began escorting Kuwaiti tankers that had been reflagged under American colors, putting U.S. Navy vessels in direct contact with Iranian forces. On July 3, 1988, the USS Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser operating in the Persian Gulf, detected an aircraft on radar approaching from Iran, and the crew, operating in a combat zone and having recently engaged Iranian gunboats, believed they were tracking an Iranian F-14 fighter on an attack profile. At 10:24 in the morning, the Vincennes fired two SM-2MR surface-to-air missiles that struck what was actually Iran Air Flight 655, an Airbus A300 civilian airliner on a scheduled flight from Tehran to Dubai, climbing in a commercial air corridor and broadcasting civilian transponder signals, killing all 290 people aboard when the plane disintegrated and fell into the Gulf. The tragedy demonstrated how the war's expansion risked catastrophic accidents and potential superpower confrontation, with the United States expressing regret but not apologizing, while claiming the crew acted in self-defense based on information available to them, though Iran called it deliberate murder. The incident inflamed tensions at a critical moment, as Iran was considering whether to continue a war that had brought nothing but suffering and demonstrated American willingness to intervene militarily if Iranian victory appeared possible. Throughout the mid and late 1980s, both nations launched missiles at each other's cities in campaigns designed to terrorize civilian populations. Iraq used Soviet-supplied Scud missiles modified to extend their range, though they were not precision weapons that could hit military targets with any reliability but could hit cities. Iraqi Scud missiles fell on residential neighborhoods, markets, schools, and hospitals, as air raid sirens became part of daily life, with civilians rushing to shelters when sirens sounded. The randomness made the terror worse, as no one knew where the next missile would fall, while Iran launched its own missiles at Iraqi cities, where strikes killed civilians and damaged buildings. Militarily pointless attacks that reflected both sides' desperation when battlefield victory proved impossible. By 1988, 8 years of war had exhausted both nations, as Iran's economy collapsed under the strain, while oil revenues could not fund both the war effort and basic government functions. The population was tired of casualties after hundreds of thousands of young men had died in attacks that achieved little. Iraq, though receiving substantial foreign aid, faced similar economic stress, having accumulated crushing debts. In early 1988, Iraq launched major offensives, recapturing territory Iran had seized, with Iraqi forces retaking the Four Peninsula in April, using chemical weapons extensively. These victories, combined with the July 3rd downing of the Iranian airliner by American forces, convinced Iranian leadership that continuing the war served no purpose. Khomeini faced the reality that Iran could not achieve its objective of overthrowing Saddam. On July 18, 1988, Iran sent a letter to the United Nations, accepting Security Council Resolution 598, which called for an immediate ceasefire between Iran and Iraq after the resolution had been passed a year earlier, but Iran had rejected it, insisting that Saddam must be held accountable for starting the war before any ceasefire could be considered. 2 days later, on July 20th, Ayatollah Khomeini addressed the Iranian nation in a speech broadcast on radio, explaining the decision with bitter honesty, acknowledging that accepting the ceasefire without achieving the war's objectives was worse for him than taking poison. And the phrase "drinking from a poisoned chalice" entered Iranian political vocabulary to describe accepting an unbearable necessity. Khomeini explained that military commanders had advised him Iran lacked the capacity to continue fighting effectively, as the economy could not sustain further war, while international isolation was complete, and continuing meant potential defeat far worse than negotiated ceasefire. He accepted the resolution, he said, because the survival of the Islamic Republic required it, not because he wanted peace with Saddam, revealing the depth of bitterness in a man who had promised his followers that revolutionary determination would overcome material weakness. The ceasefire took effect on August 20th, 1988, at 3 o'clock in the morning, and after 8 years, the guns fell silent along the Iran-Iraq border as soldiers on both sides, exhausted men who had lived in trenches and endured artillery bombardments, chemical attacks, and human wave assaults, climbed from their positions. Some wept, while others simply sat in silence, processing the reality that the war that had consumed their youth was finally over, and that nothing had been achieved except the casualty lists. Formal peace negotiations began in Geneva under UN auspices, dragging on for 2 years before producing a final settlement that essentially returned to the status quo ante-bellum, where borders remained unchanged. Neither side achieved its objectives after 8 years of slaughter, and the human cost was staggering, with estimates of total deaths ranging from 500,000 to over 1 million, the majority being Iranian casualties, particularly among the young Basij volunteers. Both economies were devastated, as Iraq had accumulated debts exceeding $80 billion to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, debts that Iraq expected would be forgiven, expectations that would contribute to tensions leading to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait 2 years later. Iran's economy required years to rebuild, as oil facilities destroyed by Iraqi attacks remained in ruins, while an entire generation of young men had been killed or traumatized. The Iran-Iraq War demonstrated that modern nations with nationalist fervor, ideological commitment, and access to weapons can wage prolonged conflicts even when neither side can achieve victory and when the war serves no rational purpose. The war succeeded for no one, as Iraq ended with massive debts, hundreds of thousands dead, and no territorial changes after 8 years, with these debts contributing to Saddam Hussein's decision to invade Kuwait in 1990, while Iran preserved its revolution, but at terrible cost, as the generation mobilized for war was decimated. International involvement in the war, particularly Western support for Iraq, despite its use of chemical weapons, demonstrated the cynicism of great power politics, where the United States and European nations armed Saddam Hussein even as he gassed Iranian troops, then went to war against him 2 years later when he invaded Kuwait. The war's most enduring legacy was the normalization of chemical weapons use, as Iraq faced no meaningful consequences for using them on a massive scale, establishing a precedent that weakened prohibitions against weapons of mass destruction. The human cost was staggering, including hundreds of thousands of young Iranian volunteers who died running across minefields and into machine gun fire, while Iraqi soldiers died in trenches and civilians died when missiles fell on cities. The economic destruction set both nations back years, as resources that could have built schools and hospitals were consumed in weaponry, with oil facilities and infrastructure devastated. The Iran-Iraq War teaches that wars can continue for years even when achieving nothing, that international law provides little protection against determined aggressors backed by powerful supporters, and that ideological conflicts can produce suffering on a massive scale with no compensating achievements. The war stands as one of the 20th century's deadliest and most pointless conflicts. 8 years of slaughter that changed nothing except the casualty lists.